to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens.
Welcome to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. I'm Rick Lee, and I'm joined, as always, by my friends and co-hosts Lee Johnson and David Gunkel. And today we are talking about ideology and self-emancipation with a special guest, Will Roberts. Before we get to that, as usual, let's get some drinks, and I want to hear if you're ranting or raving. So, David, let's start with you. What are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving?
So in terms of drinking, I need to have a very strong intelligentsia dark roast coffee. I went to go see my kids' band play last night. I wasn't overserved, but talking about alcohol right now doesn't sound like a good idea. And because of that, I am going to be ranting about the Mocha Express by Bialetti. So the Mocha Express, created by Bialetti in 1933, is an Italian coffee maker that sits on your stovetop. It is the simplest, most direct way of making coffee. It's been doing it for almost 100 years, and it does a damn good job of making coffee. I have not bought any other coffee maker ever, and it is the only way to drink coffee at home. So I'm just going to celebrate not only the coffee from the machine, but also the design of the machine. It's a really well-designed product, and I wish so many things in our world actually worked as well as this coffee maker.
You hear that, Apple?
No.
We know Apple's a big fan of the podcast. Lee, what about you? What are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving?
Well, in honor of our guest today, I'm going to go back to my Pennsylvania roots, and I am just going to have a Yingling to drink.
Nice.
And today I am raving about the Data Workers Inquiry Project. So this project was started by DARE, which is the Distributed AI Research Institute, and that was started by very famous AI ethicist Timnit Gebru. They created this research group in which data workers come together and lead their own inquiry in their respective workplaces. And I just want to read what they stated in their advertisement of this workshop. They say, "We adapt Marx's 1880 workers' inquiry to the phenomenon of data workers who are both essential for contemporary AI applications, yet precariously employed, if at all, and politically dispersed." And I would just like to see more tech workers adopt this kind of approach to the stuff that they're doing. So good on DARE and good on the Data Workers Inquiry Institute. So, as Rick mentioned, we have a special guest with us today, Will Roberts. Will is an associate professor of political science at McGill University in Montreal and a very old friend of mine and Rick's. Well, he's not very old, but the friendship is very old. He's also currently working on a manuscript entitled The Radical Politics of Freedom, which we're all really excited about, but he says it may be a couple of years, so don't get too excited just yet. Will, we want to welcome you to Hotel Bar Sessions and ask you, what are you drinking and what are you ranting or raving about?
It's great to be here. Thanks, Lee. So today I'm going to drink a Garibaldi, which is Campari and orange juice, named for Garibaldi, the Republican nationalist that helped unify Italy into a nation state eventually in the 19th century. It is supposed to symbolize the unification of Italy with orange juice from the south and Campari from the north. And it's a beautiful red color, so maybe it should be called more like the Gramsci Garibaldi. So that's what I'm drinking today. I'm very tempted to rant, but if I started ranting, I would just rant all day and into the night and into tomorrow.
Feel that.
So I'm going to hold off on the ranting. I'm going to rave instead about Divest for Palestine Collective at McGill. There's been a Palestine solidarity encampment asking for divestment and academic boycott of Israeli institutions at McGill since late April. And this morning, very early in the morning, the McGill administration called private security in to dismantle the encampment and to kick everyone out. So currently, right now, as we record this, security is trying to kick people out. A few people are staying put and trying to hold off. And there's a solidarity protest around McGill trying to back people up. And Divest for Palestine Collective is one of the groups of students who are at the encampment. And I'll just read a brief statement from them. They said, "We are told that we were breaking into our own campus to protest the fact that our tuition money is being used to fund companies that kill Palestinians. As we continue to see bodies pulled from the rubble, I promise that students will not end the fight for divestment at this encampment." And so I want to rave about my students. I think they're awesome.
Hear, hear.
Solidarity.
Yes.
Rick, what about you? What are you drinking and what are you ranting and raving about?
Well, for the second time in the history of this podcast, I am recording this episode under the condition of having COVID.
Ugh.
You know, doctors, I don't know if I should trust them or not, but they're recommending I don't really drink. And so I'm just going to have a double espresso with a glass of water. Related to that, I am raving about the staff and personnel of the Hotel Imperiale in Rimini. I came down with COVID while staying at this hotel, and everyone there took such great care of me and were so concerned about me. It was really quite touching, and in ways they didn't have to be, and they went out of their way. And so I want to shout out to the staff in this place for taking care of a sick, miserable American.
Oh.
So Lee, I know we're talking about ideology and self-emancipation, but how are we going to approach this?
Well, ideology is the lens through which we interpret and make sense of the world around us, as we discussed in our previous episode on ideology. It shapes our beliefs and influences our actions and underpins the structures of power and society. From its inception as a science of ideas in the work of de Tracy through its radical redefinition by Marx and Engels, ideology has remained at the heart of intellectual debates about human nature, freedom, and emancipation. It is both a tool of enlightenment and a weapon of control, capable of liberating minds or ensnaring them in false consciousness. In the context of our modern world, the study of ideology is more relevant than ever, especially when it comes to political polarization or social injustice and many other global crises. Understanding the forces that shape our perceptions and drive our collective actions is crucial. Ideology, after all, is not just an abstract concept confined to academic discourse. It is a living, breathing force that impacts our daily lives and the very fabric of our societies. So today we are really, really lucky to have Will join us to talk about a recent essay of his that helps us think through the historical evolution of ideology, its critical applications in the struggle for self-emancipation, and its significance in contemporary politics. So with his help, we hope these four philosophers can, borrowing from Karl Marx, not only interpret the world, but change it. Like I said, we are very, very lucky to have Will with us here today. Will is actually an old Penn State friend of both Rick and mine, so it's very good to see your face again. And it was very, very exciting to read your recent essay, Ideology and Self-Emancipation. I want to just note for listeners that only a few weeks ago, we did do an episode on ideology. And it turns out that in between us recording it and it being put on the air, Will's essay came out. I was in the process of editing our ideology episode when I thought, shit, why did we not get to read this
Hold
essay
the presses.
before we, you're right, stop everything. But we were committed at that point, and so we just put our episode out. However, it did occur to us that there's no reason why we can't revisit ideas that we've already visited before, and this was a particularly good opportunity to do that. So, Will, if it's okay, I would like to ask you first just to generally summarize this essay, Ideology and Self-Emancipation, and the argument that you're putting forward in it.
Yeah, I'm glad you liked the essay. It came out of a place of deep confusion. Basically, I was running across ideology more and more as I was trying to write this book, and it seemed like ideology was said and used in so many different senses. that it was really hard to pin down where people were disagreeing with one another about ideology and where people were just using the same word in different senses and thereby like just talking past one another. And so I just started drilling down further and further. I became more and more convinced that the history of ideology as a word was really revelatory, at least for me. So I hope it's revelatory for other people too, or it's useful. Because there's good reason for people to be confused about what ideology is. The word has fundamentally changed its meaning multiple times over the course of the last 2.5 centuries, or really just over the last 2 centuries. So the first thing that I noticed is you have this word that is coined to mean a science of ideas, and then it very quickly becomes instead the ideas that are not scientific or the ideas that need a scientific explanation, right? That need to be explained not on the basis of their own content and their internal reasons, but need to be explained scientifically by something outside of themselves.
Right.
So that's already a little weird. Second, as I read Destutt de Tracy, who's this very interesting guy in some ways, French aristocrat, becomes a Republican, serves in the French Senate, is a member of the New Institute of France. He and some of his colleagues, they were trying to devise a new secular education system for France. His great work is this multi-volume work called Elements of Ideology. Part of it concerns political economy, and it was translated by Thomas Jefferson and was actually the textbook for political economy at the University of Virginia when Jefferson set up the University of Virginia. Destutt de Tracy's commentary on Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws was also the textbook for political science at the University of Virginia under Thomas Jefferson. Wow. So like Destutt de Tracy's whole project was this pedagogical one, and Thomas Jefferson tried to transplant that pedagogical project into the American context. So an interesting guy. But as I read his Elements of Ideology, the part that Jefferson translated, I saw he literally poses ideology as a solution to the problem of false consciousness. He uses the phrase false consciousness. So here's another one of these reversals where in the 20th century, we associate ideology with false consciousness, but it was proposed precisely as an antidote to false consciousness. Then I go back to Marx and Engels' manuscripts on the German ideology. I never refer to them, or I try not to refer to them as a book, as the German ideology, because they weren't. There's a great article on this by University of Chicago faculty member Sarah Johnson. The title of her article is Farewell to the German Ideology. It does a good job of surveying the evidence for the fact that the German ideology was actually a set of manuscripts that were probably going to be another journal, sort of like the Deutsche Französische Jahrbuch that Marx had been part of in Paris. Anyways, I revisited those manuscripts, which is the center of where Marx talks about ideology, and I realized that Marx cites Destutt de Tracy in there. And in fact, Marx read Destutt de Tracy in 1844, just shortly before writing these manuscripts. And he's explicitly comparing his fellow left Hegelians in Germany, so especially Bruno Bauer, his former mentor, and Max Stirner, to Destutt de Tracy. He's comparing their project, the left Hegelian project, to ideology, a project of trying to enlighten people, teach people to be free, and to teach them to be free by freeing them in particular from ideas that dominate their mind. The various superstitious ideas, the various irrational ideas that dominate their minds. And Marx is making fun of that project. When he calls them the German ideologists, that's what he's making fun of, is that project of trying to teach people to discard their false consciousness. So then I'm confronted by this other transformation. That left Hegelian project looks a lot like the 20th century project of ideology critique, as it's carried out by the Frankfurt School, for example. But it's that project Marx is referring to as ideology.
Right.
So with all of these complete reversals over the course of a couple centuries, I just felt like I needed to dig into that history and tease it out a little bit. And so that's what the essay tries to do.
So I have in the back of my mind that there is some kind of rhetorical trope in which the content of something takes on the name of that thing. And so in the shift in the meaning of ideology, it seems like the content of ideology now becomes called ideology. And I can kind of see how that happened. But it seems like there's still one problem remaining that Marx really does want to confront. And I'll put it in terms outside of Marx, that if we take it for granted that Marx gives a successful and truthful critique of capital and capitalism, we have to somehow account for how it is that hasn't ended capitalism. There is something there that has to do with an inability to recognize a reality or something like a reality that still needs to be given an account. And I think many people, maybe more in the 20th and 21st century, turn to what they call ideology to be that account, to show how it is that although something is true, the exposure of the truth of that doesn't bring about its demise.
Yeah, right. So I think Marx was very well aware of that. That is, in fact, part of what he is mocking in the German ideologists. I think his answer to that is different from the 20th and 21st century answer. But Marx's answer is also, in a recognizable sense, a predecessor of the 20th and 21st century answer.
Right.
It sets the terms, and you can see how the 20th and 21st century response comes back in. At a basic sense, I've come to believe that ideology in its origin is fundamentally about enlightenment.
Right.
The project of ideology is the project of enlightenment. When Kant defined enlightenment in his essay, What is Enlightenment? Very handy title, tells you exactly what we're going to do here. Kant defines enlightenment as humanity's exit from its self-incurred minority status. There's a sort of paradox here. So he's defining enlightenment as humanity's exit from, taking ourselves out of a situation in which we are under the guidance of or in the hands of another. The German is unmündig. We're not in our own hands.
Right.
That's a condition of a sort of irresponsibility. But it's a condition of irresponsibility, being in someone else's hands, that we are ourselves culpable for.
Right.
It's something we do to ourselves. And in that sense, enlightenment has always been about the emergence from voluntary servitude. And I think that is at the core of the idea of enlightenment, and it's at the core of the idea of ideology, as ideology was originally propounded by Destutt de Tracy. And that same idea is then at the core of 20th century ideology critique.
Right.
That it is a project of enlightenment. So Marx is very close to that project, but on a slightly different terrain. So his inaugural address and the rules of the International Working Men's Association from 1864, they proclaim that emancipation of the working class is the task of the working class itself. This is self-emancipation, right? The project of socialism is working class self-emancipation. That notion of collective self-emancipation is at the core of radical politics right through the 19th and 20th century. It's at the core of W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. It's at the core of Martin Luther King's thought. It's at the core of Frantz Fanon's thought. Like, it's just at the core of radical thought. So as soon as you are on that terrain of collective self-emancipation, you're very close to this terrain of enlightenment. And therefore, you're always caught up, or very close to being caught up, in the problematic of ideology. So in that sense, I think it's kind of inescapable. I'm just trying to follow traces that aren't made explicit, or maybe made as explicit as they could be in Marx, in Lenin, in this history of thinking about these problems. We can draw a distinction between thinking of self-emancipation as emancipation from ruling ideas, and thinking about self-emancipation as a practical process of working out new institutions
right.
that can build into a freer form of life. And I think that there's room to maintain that distinction. That's the sort of takeaway that I want to, I don't know, I want to keep thinking about that. That's what's important for me. Like for Marx, ideologists, that's a place in the social division of labor. It's a set of people who are removed from real sources of power in society. And in being removed from the real sources of power in society, therefore think that their own activity is more important than it actually is to the reproduction of that society. So for Marx, it's about shifting our attention to different places in society and to think about, yes, the efficacy of telling the truth, but also the efficacy of changing people's minds or the efficacy of conscious thought.
Well, I think one of the things that's really great about your essay is exactly this genealogical work that you do on the idea of ideology. It's so helpful. And I think, as you were describing earlier, all of these twists and turns and positions and reversals in our understanding of ideology largely come down to one central question: is ideology emancipatory or is it enslaving? Anyone listening who may not know all of these particular figures that you've been referring to can just hear the question and can just hear the development of the debate and say, well, of course it's both. Ideology can be emancipatory and of course it can be enslaving. That leads me to ask you a question that came up frequently in our earlier discussion about ideology, which is, does that then mean that it's just ideology all the way down, right? That to even make an argument about whether one's own ideology is emancipatory or enslaving, or someone else's ideology is emancipatory or enslaving, itself requires an ideological argument. So, yeah, I mean, I just want to kind of put that question back to you, because Rick, in our previous episode on ideology, was very depressed by the idea that it might be ideology all the way down. I was less depressed, but I would like to hear your position on this.
Yeah. So my position on this is going to require a couple of ancillary steps before actually addressing the question. So
pour yourself a drink, listeners.
yeah, exactly. So first of all, like if you just look around in the 20th century, 21st century, you look at the philosophical literature, like one of the big divides is between those people who use ideology in an inherently critical or a pejorative sense. Mm-hmm. So the Frankfurt School uses ideology in a pejorative sense. A lot of philosophers use ideology in a pejorative sense. And those who use ideology in fundamentally a descriptive sense. There just are ideologies. There are always lots of ideologies. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, etc. Political scientists use ideologies in that descriptive sense, but so do some Marxists. So does Althusser.
Right.
Ideology is always with us, right? We will always be in ideology. It's just a fact of life. It's not good or bad inherently. Mm-hmm. Okay, so on that divide, I'm firmly in the descriptive camp. Right? I think that thinking of ideology in a purely pejorative, purely critical sense is a dead end.
Yeah.
In part because what that does is it poses as the outside of ideology something like science, pure reason, or an outside that does the thing that Marx diagnosed in the third thesis on Feuerbach, where he says that previous materialism has always recognized the ways in which the world and our upbringing shape us, and then has wanted to change how people are brought up, change the environment, and thereby change people. And Marx says, but the educator must himself be educated. The point being that this notion of enlightenment always divides society into two parts. One part of which is above society and outside of society. That's the dead end of enlightenment. So I want to resist that. Mm-hmm. However, I think you can retain a purely descriptive concept of ideology, acknowledge that we are always in ideology, that ideology might help us, might hurt us. I mean, I think Rick's concern was that that boils down to a pure relativism.
Right.
Where we lose capacity to escape from our particular partisan viewpoint. And we lose any capacity to judge whether a particular ideology is helpful or harmful.
Yeah, you can't get, a point and a lever long enough.
Right.
I'm sympathetic to that. You can make a distinction between ideology, and this is where I try to go with Gramsci and Althusser and Goran Therborn, whose book, The Power of Ideology and the Ideology of Power, is great, that you can understand ideology as the set of first and second person discourses that recruit us to do things, to be a particular way, to identify a particular way. I think you can differentiate between those and a more impersonal third person descriptive account of social power.
Yeah.
The price is you have to acknowledge that that account of social power, which I think is absolutely necessary, isn't going to tell you what to do.
Right.
It's not going to give you marching orders. The question of what to do is always going to itself be an ideological question.
Yeah.
So that's the way that I want to try to parse this. I want to be able to retain this analytical, more impersonal, social theoretical perspective and say that's valid and real and vital and important, but also to recognize that it's not going to give us marching orders.
Yeah.
This is all really good, and I've been thinking about all of this as you've been talking. I want to throw two other names into the mix. Let's save Zizek for later.
Let's always save Zizek for later. That on my t-shirt.
Yeah, there you go.
The eternal deferral of Zizek.
Yeah.
It's Zizek with an A.
Yeah.
So all this talk of emancipation and liberation and escape gets me back to Hegel, and especially the master-slave dialectic. And I'm recalling something, I think it is in the Archaeology of Knowledge, where Foucault says that our modern age has been trying to escape Hegel. I mean, this notion of the escape from or the emancipation from Hegel as defining the modern, postmodern condition. I think one of the interesting things is that ideology sort of functions in the same way that Foucault thinks Hegel functions, right? As soon as you think you're outside ideology, you're back in it. There's a way in which ideology is already setting a trap for you. Mm-hmm. As soon as you start to critique it, do a genealogy of it, whatever the case may be, you're going to find yourself drawn back into ideology in that sort of Godfather sense. You know, as soon as I think I'm out, they draw me back in. And I'm wondering if that is really one of the troubling aspects of ideology and kind of what you're struggling against. The way in which it keeps changing its definition and flipping the script on you is its strategy by which to recapture any effort to emancipate yourself from it.
I want to say yes and no to that. I mean, on the one hand, I would sort of go all in on that and say, yeah, ideology is very much like Hegel because Hegel is the purest condensation of ideology that there is. Mm-hmm. Right? Like what Hegel does is gives you an internal perspective, that subjective experience of the totality. And yeah, that's ideology. So I don't think you can escape ideology, just like I don't think you can escape Hegel. But that doesn't mean that's all there is either. So we can't do without it. We can't get out of it. Freedom isn't getting out of ideology. It's not getting outside our subjective position. It's not completely depersonalizing ourselves, attaining a viewpoint from nowhere or anything like that. But rather, freedom always means freedom from a concrete set of powers that are real and that can be talked about without having complete and total recourse to that subject-centered position, even if that subject-centered position is absolutely essential and absolutely ineliminable. So it's not about getting rid of it, but it is about always supplementing it.
Glasses and challenging ideas is kind of our thing here at Hotel Bar Sessions, but both the drinks and the server space cost money. You can help keep this podcast independent and ad-free by signing up to be a Hotel Bar Sessions patron at patreon.com/Hotel Bar Sessions. For less than the cost of a mild night of drinking per month, you'll be helping to defray the many costs of our podcast and saving us from having to start our own cult. If you'd prefer to make a one-time donation or several of them, just visit our website at hotelbarpodcast.com, where you can find links to support this podcast through Venmo, PayPal, or Cash App. As always, we appreciate your listening, and especially your helping us to keep pouring wisdom one conversation at a time.
One of the things, Will, in your article that struck me, and I don't think it's come up yet in our discussion here, is that this notion of self-emancipation, that self is not exclusively an individual. That is, one could talk about at great length because, well, Marx does at great length and so on. By and so on, I mean Lukács does and others. The self-emancipation of the proletariat or the working class. Gramsci has his own contributions to this. I think the organic intellectual is one element of this puzzle. But I just want you to talk a little bit about the self not being an isolated individual liberal self in this project of self-emancipation, because I think that helps open this up to the role of ideology in class struggle.
Yeah, good point. So you're absolutely right that the self in self-emancipation is not an individual. I think the problem of a collective self,
right,
that's where we run into difficulties. How is a collective self identified? How does a collective self act? How can you tell whether or not you are part of a collective self? I can't pretend to have good answers to those questions. But I do think that the problems there go deeper than is sometimes imagined. So at one point late in the German ideology manuscripts, in the discussion of Stirner, Marx has this aside about how ideologists always have recourse to the notion of freedom as self-determination. So thinking about self-emancipation in a non-ideological way, or in a way that is not purely reducible to ideology, would also mean thinking about self-emancipation in a way that figured out how to depart from the framework of collective self-determination. Because the framework of collective self-determination imagines or figures collective freedom as the constitution of a collective self with a unified will that then can give laws and norms to itself as a collectivity. That produces a whole set of aporia. So in the political theory literature, the way that collective self-determination is often cashed out is in terms of majoritarian democracy. If we have good deliberative procedures and majoritarian democracy, then the laws that are passed by a democratic legislature are binding on all members of the community. And in practice, that's what collective self-determination means. But in political theory, there's this well-known problem of bounding the demos. Like when we talk about collective self-determination in that democratic self-legislation sense, then we have to say, well, who's in and who's out?
Right.
Whose voice gets to be part of deliberations, who gets to vote, etc. And I don't think there are any good answers to those questions. What that means for me is that we have to think about all of this stuff. We have to think about collective freedom. We have to think about democracy outside of the frame of collective self-determination, because we can't bound a self, a collective self, in that way, in any rational way. So how is it that we might proceed? I think we find ourselves to be part of collectivities when we recognize that we are going to be treated as interchangeably with a series of others. And oftentimes that identification, like, oh, I am being identified as, comes through forms of domination, right? It is when people are identified as liable to violent interdiction by the police that they might recognize themselves as, oh, I'm being treated like this whole series of other people. We are the class of ones subject to this particular form of dominating intervention. So processes, I think, of collective self-emancipation involve recognizing the group that is subject to forms of dominating power, and then trying to create a sort of fighting institution amongst that group that can push back against that particular form of domination. We're not arriving at the state of collective self-determination because the self of the group is identified not immanently, but is defined externally by being subject to a particular form of domination. And that's what gives a certain warrant to the fighting institution of self-emancipation. That's what gives it a license to act in the name of that collectivity.
I really appreciate you pointing out the difficulties with thinking a universal collective. Obviously, this is not a new problem, but a struggle that I've had when thinking about emancipatory ideologies is that, of course, we know historically that there have been many emancipatory ideologies that have worked on the basis of dominating others, right? I mean, the whole history of race theory, of feminist theory, of class struggle is about this. Lots of different collectives seeking self-emancipation, but achieving it through the domination of other collectives also seeking self-emancipation. And I think that sometimes it's difficult for people to understand how that happens without just giving themselves a really reductive account of whatever the self-emancipatory ideology that they're pointing to really is about. And just to go back to your rave from this week, I think that we currently see this in the pro-Palestinian struggle, right? A lot of people are saying, if you're pro-Palestinian, then you're anti-Semitic or you're pro-Hamas, and you're denying the problems of anti-Semitism, you're denying the effects of the post-World War II Jewish world in the state of Israel, etc. Obviously, we know, if we sit down calmly and think about it, that is not the same as protesting the genocide of the Palestinian people. Obviously, those two aren't the same things. But it becomes impossible to negotiate between what appear at the surface as competing self-emancipatory ideologies. And I think Rick can correct me, I might be wrong about this, but I think this was his worry about the relativism of ideology all the way down. And I think he even asked this question, we don't have a way of judging better and worse ideologies, judging between one ideology and another. And I just would like to hear your thoughts on that hornet's nest.
Yeah, it's crucial to think through carefully. So I think on the one hand, these sorts of conflicts are, yes, endemic to fights for collective emancipation. Like they're intrinsic. There's no getting out of conflicts in hard cases. So I don't think there could be a sort of pure movement of collective self-emancipation that would not engage in some of these things. My go-to example of this is that, like, I believe in labor organizing, right? I believe in the union movement. There's no way to create a union, like, without constructing forms of power over other workers that is not responsive to what they want, right? So you can't have a union movement without the ability to, like, call people scabs, right? And treat them as scabs, right? That sort of thing is baked in. That doesn't lead me to despair, and neither does it lead me to sort of cynicism, where it's like, well, then that just doesn't matter. But rather, what it leads me to say is, well, okay, then what we need in order to at least provisionally justify our forms of collective self-organization and our fighting institutions of various sorts is an account of the world of social power. We need a bigger story about what are the forms of social power, how do they interact with one another, what are their dynamics, how might a particular form of self-organization link up with other forms of self-organization elsewhere and move in the direction of a freer world overall. That's a tall order. There's no way that you're going to create a social theoretical picture of the totality of social power that is going to be uncontroversial, right? It's not as if Marx wrote Capital and then everybody was like, oh, yes, that's how the entire world of capitalism works. That problem is solved. Now we just have to settle the problem of how other things interact with that or something like that.
But this seems in tension with what you were just saying before, because if part of the project, as you just now said it, is to move towards a freer world overall, that move, what it's aiming at, the telos there, is the collective that's impossible to think that you were talking about earlier. That collective, humanity, whatever, has to be emancipated in order for that project to succeed, we'll say. So I get what you're saying now. I completely agree with you that in the trenches, this is all messy and it's impossible to pull apart all of these threads. But theoretically, if we're just using the political science, descriptive sense of ideology, we ought to be able to talk about this outside of the particular conflicts. And if it's the case that there just is, at the end of the day, no way to pull this apart, even theoretically, then I think that's something that we have to acknowledge.
Yeah, I think there's a set of thorny issues there. So first of all, I guess I would say, I do think that we have to have in mind a horizon of universal emancipation.
Right.
But I think that that can actually be cashed out not as self-emancipation of the collective humanity. This gets into a nest of other thorny issues, but into a condition of robust social security, freedom from domination that would be enjoyed by each and every human being.
Yeah, well said.
I think we can acknowledge that as an orienting horizon for our struggles. We can acknowledge that and also acknowledge that condition could only be built out of various institutionalized powers that are never going to fully instantiate the ideal that we want them to instantiate.
Right.
If freedom involves everybody having power to insist on their own desires, their own choices, well, all of those powers are potentially going to be experienced as dominating by somebody else. If freedom and power are always going to be going together, we ought not think that we're ever going to be in a space beyond politics, beyond struggles, beyond fights in the name of freedom.
Yeah.
Can I drag this back down into the trenches just for a moment? To what extent does this way of thinking about universalism that you just articulated, to what extent is that still a very humanist project? Because it sounds like the collective here is a human collective. And we don't live on a planet with just humans. So what if we start to think in a more post-human way about these struggles? Try to think about a collective that is not just a human collective, but as a collective of environment, animals, everything else that makes up the world that we are a part of. How does that either complicate the picture or how does that enhance the picture as you see it?
So, two things. I answer all questions with two things. Anyways.
It's better than the Hegelian 3.
It's always good to have a backup.
Yeah. So, first of all, I want to refuse humanism of the sense that it's a human collective. I think that that's a problem. That's why when I answered Lee's question, I wanted to bring it back to cashing out universal freedom in terms of robust social security of each individual. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no humanism there, obviously, even if it's not a human subject or a subject of humanity as such. As Arendt says, Arendt is a problem in lots of ways, but she is good at insisting there's always a plurality of human beings. There is no humanity as such, as a one. Mm-hmm. That doesn't get rid of all humanism, though. I'm not interested in getting rid of all humanism. A certain anthropocentrism is inevitable in political strivings, not because of really strong species boundary. Certainly not because human beings are a kingdom within a kingdom or something like that, but rather because the processes of power and of domination, the way in which social relations work amongst human beings is always going to be at the heart of any political project. That just means that our relationship to the rest of nature, to non-human animals, and also to those human animals who can't talk back for one reason or another, is always going to be governed by slightly different considerations than our relations with one another insofar as we are intersubjectively and linguistically connected to one another. Mm-hmm. I just think that that's true. That's very close to the way in which we can't be outside of ideology, right? Like, if ideology is this set of first and second person perspectives and the recruitment of others into our first and second person perspectives, that's going to focus us on other human beings with whom we can engage in that sort of recruitment. And obviously, in the course of evolution or science, we open up avenues of communication and subject recruitment and so forth with non-human animals. Then just to that extent, they are going to be part of our politics in a new way.
We love that you join us here at the Hotel Bar for our boozy, brain-powered podcast. But we get a little tired of talking amongst ourselves here in a virtual bar. So if you'd like to pull up a stool beside us, and also beside other listeners in our Hotel Bar Sessions community, then follow us on Twitter at Hotel Bar Podcast. There you can also find the Twitter handles of all three of us co-hosts. For our more senior listeners, we're also on Facebook. All of our episodes are on YouTube, and from time to time, that is Lee, by the way, even make an appearance on TikTok. By the way, you could go old school and email us at any time at hotelbarpodcast@gmail.com, or you can visit our interactive page at hotelbarpodcast.com. If you have any feedback or you have ideas for episodes or to rant at us or rave about us, we have a designated reader for those messages who is mostly only a little tipsy. Who knows, your suggestion could help keep intellectual insights on tap and on the air.
All right, so we've kicked the Zizek can down the road, and we have to at least acknowledge that Zizek is a player in this domain of ideology, especially with his very influential first book, The Sublime Object of Ideology. And I think the really interesting thing about Zizek, at least in terms of his contribution here, is that he moves out of the realm of false consciousness as a kind of false belief and opens it up to a Lacanian thought of the unconscious, and that ideology is this pressure of the unconscious, or it belongs to the realm of the symbolic order, which then I think, again, shifts the way we think about ideology and the way we define it. This is not something you do in your essay, but I'm wondering how Zizek's recent innovations with the word ideology either add to or complicate what it is that you've developed in your historical account.
Yeah, I don't think I have a great answer for this.
He has two not great answers to that.
I have a long conflictual relationship with psychoanalysis in general. So I'm a little uncertain exactly where Zizek's innovations lie. Bringing Lacan in, talking about the relationship between ideology and the unconscious, modeling ideology on the unconscious, like Althusser did that.
Right.
Especially via Therborn's reconstruction. Like, I can recognize that as having a utility in terms of talking about the duality of agency, right? The way in which every agent is both a center of action and an agent of a principle that lies somewhere outside of themselves.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So that duality of agency, I can recognize the psychoanalytic heritage embedded in that, and the Lacanian in particular heritage embedded in that. And from my perspective, I've always been like, okay, that's good enough for me. Like, if Zizek has something else to add, I don't know what it is, and I don't feel the need for it, so I'm just going to let him lie. So if you can tell me what more there is there, I always have a guilty conscience. And if you prick it, I will end up going back to Zizek and kicking myself and reading through it again. But right now, I'm sleeping okay.
But if I could add to, Will, you're having recourse to Louis Althusser here, I would point out Althusser's own reliance on Spinoza to get at this. And just so we don't get into technical Spinozistic vocabulary, the way in which our imagination registers how we are affected by things in ways that, on the one hand, you might say, well, but what you're imagining is not true. And nonetheless, it brings about responses in me that are just as real as anything else. And I think Althusser, in one very suggestive footnote in For Marx, points to this issue in Spinoza being really central to these problems of ideology. And I'm not sure I need any Lacanian innovations in order to get everything you just laid on the table. So I'm with you. I mean, I'm on record as being incredibly suspicious of psychoanalysis.
Awesome. Stop the tape. We're done here.
So I don't want to defend Zizek or even go into the details. I just want to ask you this question. So if indeed these ways of engaging these ideas have been in play for a number of years prior to Zizek, why is it then that people have really focused on Zizek recently as the guy who's doing the work here? I mean, why haven't these dots been connected? Is it just because no one has bothered to trace it out? Or is it because there's something about our current state of mind with regards to ideology that makes that land in the way that it does? I'm just sort of not worried. I'm just interested about this phenomenon that this has brought about.
I mean, obviously, Zizek is a phenomenon unto himself. He is a canny and heavily mediatized theorist, and that fits what he thinks, too. It all makes sense. And so I am grateful Zizek is around to bring certain things up and to attract attention to certain questions, and also don't feel a great deal of obligation to pay attention to the man himself.
So he's doing the work of ideology.
Well, we all are.
I'd like to make a turn in the conversation here. Apologies, Slavoj. But I want to ask about this relationship between ideology and false consciousness. So one of the things, as David and Rick will tell you, that I'm sort of obsessed with in this podcast is trying to start off with a definition of things. And we tried to do that in our ideology episode. Like, what is an ideology? And I tried to argue that although we generally think of an ideology as a set of beliefs or opinions, that in our actual experience of ideological commitments and in our actions, we treat our ideological commitments as if they are knowledge, as if they are facts, and our opposition to ideologies as if the other ideological commitments are falsehoods. And I think this is where we get our common usage of the phrase false consciousness, right? You've just been hoodwinked, right? You've just been brainwashed or whatever.
Right.
And so when we think about false consciousness, I think one of the things that people worry is that ideologues, in the descriptive sense of ideology, ideologues who we would say have false consciousness, that they believe that they're emancipating themselves through their ideological commitments, but in fact, their ideological commitments are just a form of voluntary servitude. I think that's what we, in general, commonly mean by false consciousness. But then I wonder, what is ideology? I mean, I want to go back to the what is ideology? Is it beliefs? Is it opinions? Is it knowledge? Is it practices? And if it is a whole messy mess of those things, I'm just going to be straightforward. Like, how is it that we can help others stop voluntarily submitting to their own subjugation?
Yeah. So I don't think the question, what is ideology, is answerable today because it would involve such a project of legislation that it could not be carried out. In fact, ideology means and is several different things. And there's no way to get around that, I think. That doesn't mean that we can't, for good reason, prefer some uses of ideology to others. I mean, I do really like the title of that volume of Zizek's Mapping Ideology. I don't think that book actually does what it should do, but I think it is possible to map out different accounts of ideology. And on the basis of mapping them out, translate them into one another so that you can orient yourself a little bit. Obviously, I do think that the pejorative conception of ideology is a dead end. I think it causes more problems than it's worth. But what is interesting to me is that that conception of ideology, the pejorative conception, the conception that ideology just is false consciousness, is motivated by a commitment to the possibility, utility, and goodness of impartial, totalized, either moral or scientific knowledge.
Yeah.
That's the commitment behind that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can tell how somebody is going to use ideology by knowing what their attitudes are towards partisanship and partiality on the one hand, and where they locate agency, what their conception of agency is on the other hand. So if you have a highly cognitivist conception of agency, where agency is intentional action on the basis of beliefs that are conscious propositional attitudes, you're going to have a highly cognitivist conception of ideology. Ideology is always going to be pegged to your conception of agency. Mm-hmm. It's always going to piggyback on your conception of agency. If you have an embodied, extended conception of agency, then you're going to think of ideology as existing in habits and bodily comportments as well, right? Yeah. You're always going to locate ideology in the same place you locate agency. If you think impartial, nonpartisan, moral knowledge is possible and good, and that is what we should be guided by, you're going to have a pejorative conception of ideology. Because ideology is always going to be keyed to partisanship and partiality. I think that that's how things have cashed out. So that doesn't give us a definition of ideology, but I think it gives us a grid of intelligibility. We can understand how people are using ideology and recognize what the actual basic commitments are driving that use of ideology. So therefore, sorry, to get back, I think that your question then is about, really, what are our attitudes about partisanship and partiality, right? Partisanship and partiality are intrinsic to moral and political action and knowledge of the world, and I'm comfortable with that. And that's why I think pejorative conceptions of ideology are dead ends. So that's what my commitments are. And I think from within that, what I also need to affirm is that when I'm inclined to say about someone, that person is just deluding themselves. They are a slave to certain idées fixes. They have imprisoned their mind within a set of conceptions. That, from me, can never mean, well, the way that I'm going to intervene there is to tell them the truth. Or the way that I'm going to interact with them is to think that I know where their real interests lie, or what they really ought to be doing if they were rational, and that that's going to govern my interactions with them. But I feel like I'm just making explicit what my commitments are and how, therefore, I'm going to approach these questions. And I don't think that I can turn those into prescriptions for other people.
Well, our bartender just said that she doesn't know where our real interests lie, but they certainly do not lie in this bar.
She says we're deluding ourselves if we think that last call does not apply to us, and she's going to come over and tell us the truth.
But Will, I really do want to thank you both for your essay, which is, I think, really helpful. As Lee was pointing out, the historical work you do to develop this concept, and then also the grid, as you just put it, that you place various concepts of ideology within and talk about what they do and where their shortcomings are and so on. And this conversation has been really helpful too. So thank you so much.
Thank you all for having me on and entertaining my wild theories.
All right, guys, we'll catch you next time.
Sounds good.
Later.
Bye.